Hello, my name is Mike Schmidtke, and I'm a fisheries scientist with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. In this presentation, I'll be discussing Amendment 60 to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan, which considers changes to the commercial permit and regulatory changes that promote commercial trip efficiency. The South Atlantic Council is one of 8 regional management councils that are responsible for managing fisheries in the U.S. exclusive economic zone, which ranges from 3 to 200 miles offshore. The South Atlantic Council is responsible for EEZ waters off North Carolina through the Florida Keys. Council members include recreational and commercial fisheries stakeholders, state marine agency representatives, and federal agency representatives. The 13 voting members include the marine agency representative from each state, 2 citizen representatives from each state, and the Southeast Regional Administrator of NOAA Fisheries. The Council's role in the management process is to develop management plans for South Atlantic fisheries and recommend regulations to NOAA Fisheries. NOAA Fisheries considers Council recommendations and implements fishery regulations for federal waters. Scoping is an early step in the amendment development process in which the Council informs the public of management issues that may require regulatory changes and requests public input on what changes should be considered. Additionally, this is an opportunity for the public to inform the Council of other management issues that may not be on their radar just yet. Amendments include 2 core components that describe the regulatory changes being considered. Actions describe the types of changes being considered. For example, an action may be to revise a commercial trip limit. Alternatives are specific options under each action. For example, maintaining a current trip limit of 100 pounds, increasing to 120 pounds, or decreasing to 80 pounds are all potential alternatives under the example action of revising a trip limit. The goal of scoping is to identify what actions and alternatives will be on the table for consideration in an amendment. After these have been fleshed out, there will be another opportunity for public input when the Council will ask for feedback on which alternatives should be selected for implementation. In June of 2024, the Council established the Snapper Grouper Commercial Subcommittee, which is comprised of a subset of Council members representing management agencies and the commercial sector. This subcommittee was charged to discuss how to improve the commercial sector of the Snapper Grouper fishery and recommend actions for the Council to take through an amendment. The subcommittee has met 3 times so far and has identified 2 main objectives to be addressed through Amendment 60. The first objective is to address issues related to the Commercial Snapper Grouper Unlimited or SG1 permit, and the second is to increase commercial trip efficiency. The Council has determined that the subcommittee will continue to meet throughout the Amendment 60 development process, reporting out to the Council's Snapper Grouper Committee. Commercial permits for the Snapper Grouper fishery were established in 1992 through Amendment 4 to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan, or FMP. In 1998, Amendment 8 established the SG1 permit, along with limited entry and the 2-for-1 permit policy for the Snapper Grouper commercial sector. The SG1 or unlimited permit allows the permit holder to harvest an unlimited overall number of snapper grouper on a given trip, subject to all species or complex specific trip limits and seasonal or other restrictions. This permit differs from the SG2 permit in that the SG2 permit holders may only harvest a maximum of 225 pounds of snapper grouper per trip. Permit holders who landed at least 1,000 pounds of snapper grouper in any year between 1993 and 1996 were eligible for an original SG1 permit. Limited entry for the commercial sector of the snapper grouper fishery means that after implementation of Amendment 8, no additional SG1 permits would be issued. Anyone seeking to enter that component of the fishery must do so by acquiring existing SG1 permits. Finally, the 2-for-1 policy means that if an SG1 permit is transferred, the entity that purchased the permit must purchase a second existing SG1 permit to exchange the two current permits for one new SG1 permit. Thus, one SG1 permit would be retired with each transfer to a new entity. The programs of Amendment 8 were initially established due to concerns during the mid-1990s about potential overcapacity in the commercial fishery and excess competition over the snapper grouper resource among commercial and recreational fishermen. Limited entry was selected through a survey as the preferred course of action among active commercial fishermen at that time. The provisions of Amendment 8 were intended to prevent overfishing while also promoting a more economically sustainable fishery for the current participants. Additionally, the 2-for-1 policy was not intended to be permanent, but to remain in place until the optimum level of vessels in the fishery was reached. However, Amendment 8 did not specify how to determine this optimum level. More recently, comments from commercial fishermen have prompted several council discussions about the optimum level of vessels and whether that level has been achieved, removing the need for the 2-for-1 policy to continue. Comments have noted difficulties for new entrants due to the limited number of permits available for sale and high financial costs associated with acquiring a single permit, let alone a second. Some comments have also noted the need for younger participants, as members of the commercial fleet that originally received SG1 permits are aging out of the fishery. In addition to SG1 permit issues, the Council has also heard several comments from commercial fishermen that have noted the need for more efficiency on commercial trips. With rising costs over time due to changes in prices of fuel, bait, boats, and maintenance materials, as well as lower catch limits for several snapper grouper species, commercial fishermen have spoken about the need for more creative methods that allow profitable and sustainable fishing under current conditions. The Council began formally discussing commercial efficiency issues in 2024 with the formation of the Commercial Subcommittee. However, this initiative also aligns with directives stated in Executive Order 14276, which was released in April of 2025. Among several other initiatives, the executive order directed councils to investigate ways to reduce the regulatory burden on commercial fishermen, which is consistent with the objectives for Amendment 60. The Council is considering 5 actions at this point in the process. As the amendment is developed, actions may be removed or added. Also, the structure of the actions may change in the process to fit the needs of the Council and the Fishery Management Plan. First, the Council is considering revision of the 2-for-1 policy for SG1 permits. None of the actions in this amendment would affect the limited entry nature of the snapper grouper commercial fishery, so this would only change the requirement for 2 permits to be acquired in order for 1 new permit to be active. Alternatives could include immediate removal of the 2-for-1 policy or definition of the optimum level of vessels that would specify conditions when the policy would be removed in the future. If the 2-for-1 policy is removed, the Council would also need to consider whether any replacement requirements for new entrants, such as income or landings requirements, should be put into place. Next, the Council is considering establishing a framework for dynamic trip limits. Such limits have been called step-ups or step-downs, depending on whether the trip limit could be increased or decreased based on harvest to that point in the fishing year. A previous example of this type of limit was in place for the commercial fishery of vermilion snapper from 2013 to 2020. For step ups, the trip limit would be increased later in the fishing year, as long as the harvest is below a threshold level by a specified time of year. For step downs, the trip limit would be decreased later in the fishing year if harvest is above a threshold level by a specified time of year. Because the timing of a step up or step down in the trip limit would be set to achieve the optimum yield and not exceed the annual catch limit, this policy could be widely applied to commercial stocks, including those that are rebuilding. The Council has also discussed establishing multi-day trip limits for some snapper grouper species. This would allow trips that occur over multiple days to retain more than one trip limit's worth of fish. There may not be a one-to-one relationship between the number of days and the number of allowable trip limits. For example, a 2-trip limit max may be applied for a trip that lasts for 3 days. However, commercial fishermen have stated that even this level of higher limit would allow them to take longer trips rather than spending gas traveling offshore and back all on the same day. The Council did note that consideration of these trip limits would not be applicable to all components of the commercial snapper grouper fishery due to various population status and management concerns. Additionally, the Council has discussed establishing some amount of allowable harvest to occur for species that are incidentally caught out of season. This type of allowance may have effects on season length, as estimated out of season landings would need to be accounted for when comparing harvest rates with the annual catch limits. The Council has discussed the need to include conditions that would discourage targeting of out-of-season species. The Council has also discussed the potential of an out-of-season harvest allowance that would be an aggregate poundage limit that would include several snapper grouper species. Finally, the Council is considering revising stowage requirements for gear on board. Some current gear requirements do not allow fishermen to switch fishing gears within the same trip. However, adjusting the requirements could allow more multi-gear and multi-fishery trips, allowing for greater efficiency and relieving some of the pressure from fishing on one specific component of the fishery for the entire trip. These revisions would not change the types of allowable fishing gear that can be used. Additionally, only one gear would be allowed to be unstowed and available for use at a given time. Here we see the projected timeline for Amendment 60. We are currently in the scoping step of this process. Scoping for this amendment is being conducted completely online without a specific meeting for live comments. After scoping, the Council will give staff directions on how they want the amendment to be drafted. After the amendment is drafted, we'll come back out for another set of meetings and comment period to allow public input on which of the alternatives that are being considered should be the Council's preferred choices of action. Regulations from this process are expected to be effective around summer of 2027. The Council is requesting input from you on the current state of the snapper grouper commercial fishery and what changes you'd be interested in seeing. Comments do not necessarily need to address all or any of the questions that are shown on the next 2 slides, but these prompts may be useful to organize your ideas and develop your comments for this amendment. First, relative to the SG1 permits, what are the benefits and barriers that you have experienced due to the SG1 permit 2-for-1 policy? How would keeping or removing the 2-for-1 policy affect fishing operations for your area? And finally, if the 2-for-1 policy is removed, should there be any new requirements to acquire or retain an SG1 permit? Next, concerning commercial trip efficiency. Are current trip limits limiting your harvests? At what point within a trip do you begin to reduce your effort to avoid going over a trip limit? For example, maybe when you've caught 90% of your limit, you begin to dial back the effort so that you don't go over that trip limit and have to discard fish for being above. Next, would the commercial snapper grouper fishery benefit more from a higher trip limit followed by a step down as necessary, or a lower trip limit followed by a step up if possible at the beginning of the fishing season. In considering an amount of incidental or out of season harvest, should the Council develop a general policy that would be applied on a species specific basis or an overall, say, a multi species incidental poundage limit? And finally, if gear stowage requirements were changed, would you fish more for a wider variety of species or with multiple types of gear within the same trip? This scoping process is being conducted online through a document posted to the Council's website and this recorded presentation. There will be no live webinar or meeting for this process, but feel free to rewatch this presentation and reference the document as needed. Additionally, if you have clarifying questions about this process or Council discussions about the commercial snapper group or fishery thus far, please feel free to contact me, Mike Schmidtke, using the information shown on the bottom left of the screen. Written comments can be submitted online using the Amendment 60 comment form on the Council's website. Written comments can also be submitted via mail or fax using the information shown on the screen. All comments must be submitted by 5:00 p.m. on Friday, August 8th. This concludes the recorded presentation. Thank you for your time, attention, and interest in South Atlantic Council Fisheries Management.